Hello and welcome to Beth Rigby Interviews. This week I'm in conversation with the Shadow Foreign Secretary David Lammy. The big question, what would Labour do on the world stage if it were to win power? In David Lammy's eyes, Britain's reputation is in need of repair. He says Brexit and the mishandling of Britain's departure from the EU has left the UK isolated. I'll ask how Labour plans to reconnect. Lammy's also been critical of cuts to foreign aid. So could we see a return to spending 0.7% of GDP on aid? And should the West be worried after this recent show of solidarity between Russia and China? We'll also discuss Lammy's personal and political journey, campaigning on issues like the Windrush scandal.
This government holds in such disrespect the contribution of West Indian, Caribbean and black people in this country. When will Black Lives Matter once again?
That message had personal significance because both Lammy's parents travelled to Britain as part of the Windrush generation. Afterwards, his family's story was one of struggle. Lammy's father walked out when he was still a child, leaving his mother to bring up her children with little money. Despite that, Lammy defied expectations, winning a scholarship to study at one of America's most prestigious universities. He returned to Britain and moved into politics, becoming the youngest MP in the House of Commons. So how did he do it? We caught up where his story began, back at his old primary school in his Tottenham constituency. David Lammy, thanks for joining us on the show. We've got lots to talk about, but we're actually here in your old school in Tottenham, in North London. It was the early 80s when you came here and sat at these desks, actually in the library, but these were your classrooms when you were 9 and 10 years old. What expectations did you have back when you were a little boy?
Oh, look, I think I was in this when it was a classroom. It would have been in about 1979. It was a different age. And I think in those days, you know, Tottenham was we didn't travel much beyond Tottenham. It was a community of the Irish, white working class Cockney families, West Indian families, and you know, if anyone would have told me that I would be here with you now giving an interview like this, it would have been like sort of saying I was going to go to the moon. It wouldn't have made sense, to be honest. It was a long, not just time ago, but the distance travelled is immense.
Because you actually had quite a difficult start, didn't you, in the sense that your dad left when you've got 3 siblings, right?
Yes, it was, look, my family was a typical, you know, West Indian immigrant family in what felt like one of the homes of the black community, Tottenham, at that time. But the truth is, you know, my parents' marriage was not the best. The early 1980s particularly got very difficult economically, certainly difficult for my dad. He started drinking, and I never saw him after the age of 12. He left and he went to the States, never saw him again. So look, I don't want to give the impression it was all easy. It was far from easy. But I do feel warm about this school, about the wonderful teachers that were here with an incredible sense of mission. They were determined to pick me up by the scruff of the neck and get me to work and to make something of my life.
I mean, you must be one of their most famous alumni, I'm assuming, from this school. Your mum as well, I mean, she cared about education. I read somewhere that if you got a C, which I think is actually perfectly fine, just putting that on record for my own children, but if you got a C, that was a grade she did not recognise. So you were pushed.
Yes. She had been a kindergarten teacher back in the Caribbean. I think, you know, my mum was ambitious, she had a brain, but for whatever reason, poverty, she was never pushed to really excel. So she did push her kids. She wanted the best for us. And look, this was also a time difficult time. There were riots in Tottenham.
Yeah.
There were issues with policing. You know, we're talking about that now with the Casey review, but a lot of these issues have been around for a long time, and she was absolutely clear. You are not ending up in trouble with the police. You're taking your education, you're moving forward. I was blessed with a wonderful, wonderful mother.
And you lost your mum. Your mum died from ovarian cancer,
She did die from ovarian cancer.
How old were you?
Well, it was back in 2008.
Okay,
I mean,
so
I
she'd
missed
seen
her terribly, but she
she'd
had
seen
seen me
your
become. She had
success.
seen me become a member of Parliament. I won the contest to be the MP for Tottenham, actually just next door in the secondary school. So this neighbourhood of Tottenham I'm in is very much my home, and you know, I'm glad that she saw that happen.
You talk about it feels like you've landed on the moon doing what you do now, but it was a meteoric rise in that you got a scholarship to a boarding school. You then went on to become the first Black Briton to graduate from Harvard. At 27, you became an MP. You're now the Shadow Foreign Secretary. It's quite astonishing. I mean, what was in you that drove you in that way, or didn't feel like that at the time?
It always feels a bit, you know, when people look back, because the truth is, I only applied to Harvard because there was a wonderful show on TV called LA Law, and there was a wonderful black guy in it called Jonathan Rawlins, and I wanted to be him. So
Right, okay.
It's just random stuff. And then the dots connect, and you end up where you are. And
Just in terms of that, in terms of talking about role models as a Black Briton, what's your response to Humza Yousaf being elected Scotland's first minister? We have a UK Prime Minister, a Mayor of London, the Scottish First Minister, all Britons from ethnic minorities. But all of those men also from a British Asian background. Do you think it's harder for Black Britons to scale those political heights? I mean, what's your interpretation of that?
Look, I think that this country had a huge imperial story. My parents came to this country, what they called the mother country, as part of the Windrush, by virtue of that story to help rebuild this country after the Second World War. And that tale is mirrored in Sadiq Khan's story, Rishi Sunak's story, and now Humza Yousaf's story. And in a sense, I think it's a tribute to Britain that we now have these multicultural, emerging political leaders. That story will continue to be written just as we have female leaders, and there will be more female leaders and more minority leaders. We never know when, but that story will continue to be written. I'm quite sure about that.
Is it sometimes quite lonely, though, being a kind of a role model in your sphere when there aren't that many black men politicians, male black politicians? I mean, it's unusual, isn't it? And it must feel odd sometimes. Why is it unusual?
I was never anonymous in the Palace of Westminster. When I arrived, I just stood out like a sore thumb. I was a junior minister. I'd walk into a big government department and you literally, other than you and the security guys, I was the only black man in the building of thousands of people. So yeah, sometimes the burden of being the first one, the burden of leadership does feel like that. But look, that's the same in any European country, in a sense, if you're a minority. And so you kind of have to get used to it.
Now, let's get on to what you want to do next, which is to become Britain's next Foreign Secretary, your Shadow Foreign Secretary at the moment. Now, it's the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War coming up, a war you supported, and it's reminding people of how horribly wrong Labour got that. Do you see that decision to invade Iraq as a stain on Labour's history?
Look, I think it's a good question, of course. I remember, I think I'd only been in Parliament just over 2 years. In my own constituency here in Tottenham, the largest Kurdish-speaking population in the country, many Kurds who supported that war, many people who supported the idea of getting rid of Saddam Hussein. Now, I think there were two things that went fundamentally wrong. One, there were no weapons of mass destruction, and two, the preparedness, once you'd won the battle, to actually reconstruct a country was phenomenally poor. And so, like many people, if I knew then what I knew now, I would never have gone with it.
When I was up in Pendle yesterday and I was talking to some veterans, they've traditionally voted Conservative, and they raised it. I didn't raise it, but when I asked them about a possible future Labour government, they raised the Iraq War and said Blair had never apologised for that, and they were still angry about that decision. Do you think it would help if Blair apologised?
Oh, look, I think when I think about things that have gone badly wrong, I think that the Suez crisis was a low moment. I think appeasement prior to the Second World War was a low moment. I think the decision that Margaret Thatcher was making on apartheid and on not being supportive of Nelson Mandela was a low moment in our history. That's the nature of history. There are high moments and low moments, and there's always the benefit of hindsight.
Let's go to the dominant foreign policy issue you will face if you become Foreign Secretary, which is, of course, the war in Ukraine. Essentially, it seems that you're in the same place as the Conservative government. Is there something you do differently, such as offering more military support or providing fighter jets?
Beth, I am really anxious to say that the war in Ukraine, a fight against the tyranny of imperialism, a man's desire, Vladimir Putin, to ransack a country, take it over and erase its own sovereignty, is existential. It's not a party political issue, and I'm not prepared to make party political points out of it. It's not Conservative or Labour. It's fighting on the side of people who are fighting for their freedom, a freedom that we enjoy in this country and that we hold dear. So, of course, the Labour Party, and Keir Starmer reiterated this when he met Zelensky, we're there with you, politically, economically, militarily and diplomatically.
Okay, let's go to another foreign policy area that is important to all Western allies, and that's China. In recent days, you've been talking quite tough on China. You've said in government you would seek to have China's persecution of the Uyghur Muslims internationally recognised as a genocide. How would you go about that?
That's something you have to do multilaterally, but we're clear that the Biden administration has described it in that way. The UN Special Commissioner has described it in that way, and our Parliament here in the UK voted in a motion. It's a legal definition, and so that has to be done through the auspices of the UN and with others.
But what would be Beijing's reaction to that?
Well, Beijing's reaction would of course be, I suspect, to resist that. And we know that one of the issues at the moment with the United Nations and the Security Council is that Russia and China continue to use their veto as a bloc. We've not used ours since 1989. And so it is extremely difficult.
The reason I ask you this is because you say in your big blueprint for foreign policy, which we will come on to in a minute, you say you will compete, challenge, and where you can cooperate with China. But how could that possibly happen if you took that course?
I've been very clear that there are issues like climate change where we will cooperate and seek to cooperate with China. Indeed, we have a 93 billion trading relationship with China, as does the United States.
My point
but
is,
just as the United States have recently challenged China, you know, they've drafted this legislation to ensure that China that they're dealing with the issues of semiconductors, that they're dealing with the issues of the renewables, that China is much dominant in the supply chain at the moment, the United States acting to do with that. We have to do the same.
Just to be clear then, you would make that a Labour policy into the next general election?
We will work multilaterally with others.
It goes in your manifesto.
Human rights breaches.
Goes in your manifesto.
Oh, I'm not going to determine the bits of what I said that go in the manifesto because that's a scramble with lots of other colleagues. But the point is, we will always stand up for human rights.
On your foreign policy approach, Britain reconnected about connecting back and plugging the UK back more into the world. There's a theme that runs through that policy statement, which is the danger of British disconnection from the world. What's the most significant example of Britain doing that in recent years?
Tearing up our leadership on the rule of law, saying to the Americans we don't care, saying to the Europeans we don't care, and despite signing an agreement with you, We're going to introduce a bill called the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill that tears up our relationship. I think describing President Macron as an enemy, I think in the government's integrated review, not anticipating the Taliban coming back in Afghanistan and the botched withdrawal with a foreign secretary lying on the beach in Crete when he should have been attending to those issues. I think the dismantling of our leadership role in international development, all of this has been basically Britain preoccupied, not in the international game, stepping back from our usual position at a very, very dangerous time indeed.
You said it's self-evident since day Wales that no country can pursue its interests or secure its objectives alone in a world increasingly shaped by geopolitical competition, regional blocks of power and trade. We can't build our strength by going it alone. So I thought your answer would be Brexit, but it wasn't.
That theme that was used during Brexit, take back control, I want to concede that it was being used at a high point, if you like, in globalisation that was affecting many people's lives, particularly in former industrial Britain, and that it was correct. But what was wrong about the way that many Conservatives saw that phrase, take back control, was that they thought it was about Britain isolated in the world in which we could go it alone. And my message is really clear. Putin's behaviour in Russia, China's assertion in the Taiwan Seas, and its determination to change the world order in its favour. The behaviour of Iran in our own country, by the way, not just in that country. The problems we're seeing in the Middle East. All of this demonstrates that we cannot go it alone.
So presumably you wish Brexit hadn't happened?
Brexit has happened, but let us be clear. The execution of Brexit is down to Boris Johnson, Liz Truss and others. They've left us badly isolated, with trade falling badly with our European partners, with growth down, with a cost of living crisis, and with very little indication of how we will get growth back into our economy. But that
wasn't, and we will come on to that and how you might, as a Labour Party, wish to do Brexit better. But my question to you was, do you wish it hadn't happened? I wasn't asking about how it was executed. Do you wish that we had not left the European Union?
I'm a realist. Growing up in Tottenham in the 1970s and 80s, with the life that I've had, has left me a realist. It did happen. It has happened. I was on one side of that debate. I thought at the time that we should remain, but we have left the European Union. And so it's now about making the very, very best of the opportunities that we have.
Your policy statement makes it very clear that you believe isolation is a disaster for Britain. It's not the right way to go, particularly from Europe. But at the same time, you won't openly repudiate Brexit. And I find that curious. Policy-wise, it doesn't make sense because it goes against what you want.
It makes complete sense. The first thing we need to do is normalise our relations with Europe. At the moment, we've not even got a structured dialogue with Europe under this government. So let's normalise our relationship with Europe. We then need to build on the relationship that we've got.
And then in your document, you say the problem wasn't Brexit, but the way it was handled. Are you now then, David Lammy, a born-again Brexiteer?
Look, I'm what's in the interests of British people. I would say, let us put an end to the ideology and the fanaticism of groups like the ERG.
Okay.
Britain, at its best, has always been a pragmatic nation. You do what's in the interests of the British people. And at the moment, in the geopolitical world with China and Russia rising, we need to be close to our allies in Europe, both economically, of course, but certainly politically and diplomatically.
But David Lammy, people will be watching this and they would have heard you say, I'm pragmatic, we have to do what's in the interests of British people. But the Labour Party seemed to completely back a government approach to a hard Brexit, because you say that Labour's plan to reconnect with Europe while remaining outside of the EU, the single market and the customs union. You could have forged a different approach, more in line with Norway or Switzerland. You could have tried to rejoin a customs union. You explicitly rule all of this out despite The OBR saying that there will be in the long term a 4% hit to the economy over the size of the economy over the next 10 years. Why is that in the interests of the British people? It's contradictory.
I mean, Beth, in a sense, you're going back several years.
I'm saying to you, I'm saying
Beth,
that you are
Beth,
pursuing a hard Brexit approach as the Labour Party.
Beth,
you could have said we want to go back into the customs union, but you won't. Why?
Beth, Brexit has happened. We are outside of the European Union. And you and I as adults know that when you get divorced and it's messy, the idea that in a few weeks' time you can get remarried again when you haven't even been on a first date is pretty unrealistic, or indeed sorted out how you're going to take care of the children. So we have left the European Union.
Just one other thing on this. As of March 2023, 53% of people in Great Britain thought it was wrong to leave the European Union, compared with 33% who thought it was right. During the same period, people who regret Brexit have been higher than those who support it. So there is potentially a conversation to be had in this country. And isn't the truth of this, and it's okay if this is what it is, but isn't the truth that you and Keir Starmer aren't having this conversation because you're scared it will be used by the Conservatives to attack you in a general election?
Beth, let me look you in the eyes and be crystal clear. I've been to Brussels on a few occasions since I've took this job. The first thing that they say to you is, if you were to mention going back, and is there consensus in the United Kingdom? And the truth of that is that there is not consensus, because we have one political party that I'm afraid would not sign up to that. So let us not go back over the horses. The definition of madness is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome.
And now this is a question for David Lammy, the person, not the politician. Would you personally like to see reconsidered at some time in the future our relationship, our membership of the European Union? Are you a born-again Brexiteer for life? That's a personal question.
I am so not.
Are you not a born-again Brexiteer?
I am so not a born-again Brexiteer, but I'm a pragmatic politician.
The Conservative government, as you said earlier, have cut the development target from 0.7% to 0.5%. It's also emerged today from the Independent Commission for Aid Impact that a third of the Foreign Office's aid pot is currently being spent by the Home Office on domestic support for refugees and asylum seekers in the UK. Number one, do you support the use of the ODA budget to sort out issues and fund issues around domestic problems around refugees and asylum seekers? Do you support that policy?
To have got to a position where we've cut our aid budget from 0.7 to 0.5, and then we're spending £3.5 billion of taxpayers' money on hotels is a scandal. It's a scandal that means that we're doing nothing or very little to deal with those girls' education, malaria, TB, HIV, and many of those issues that drive people moving from their countries into Europe and trying to gain access to our own country. All of that's been abandoned. And I'm absolutely clear that we would not be spending the aid budget in this way, that we are committed, as soon as the fiscal environment allows, to get back to 0.7 and our global leadership in the space that's international development.
I was going to ask you that because you talk about it being a pledge, you talk about it being a strategic imperative, but you do stop short of actually formally committing to return to the 0.7%. So will you here and now commit that a future Labour government will do that?
We will return to 0.7. The issue is about how quickly we can do that in the fiscal economic environment. I wish I could tell you, Beth, that we'll do it next year, or we'll do it in the first year in office. I can't tell you that because I don't know what.
But will you do it in the next Parliament?
I don't know what the economics we will
inherit. Will you do it in the
inherit.
next Parliament if you are in government?
If I say to you now that I will do it in the next Parliament, I will be making judgments about our economy that I cannot make. And by the way, Rachel Reeves will be on the phone, so I can't give you that promise.
OK, so you're going to get Rachel Reeves to put it in the manifesto? Is that your job?
We're absolutely clear we will get back to 0.7 as soon as the fiscal climate allows.
We've seen this week Matt Hancock and Kwasi Kwarteng embarrassed by the sting operation about well-paid second jobs, and it's allowed in the rules. You've benefited from having second jobs as well, earning over £240,000 since 2019 outside of your role as Shadow Borough Secretary and MP. Much of it can be seen as political work of a sort, like your work at LBC, but other work, giving speeches, to many people it does feel wrong. Were you embarrassed or uncomfortable when that story came out?
I think there's a debate in our country about second jobs. I think those debates boil down to two issues, by the way. They boil down to lobbying and a real concern that members of Parliament are not using their status to lobby for special interests who otherwise would not get a look in, one. And two, of course, quite rightly, they're also concerned about the hours and the time that MPs are putting into other work. Parliament, I think the Labour Party's right to say that we need to fix this problem. It will be one of those issues that Parliament's going to have to determine.
Has it made you think twice about the work you're doing?
I personally don't think that presenting on LBC on a Sunday morning when I should be at church, or indeed doing after-dinner speeches. And by the way, Beth, I don't get paid what Theresa May gets paid for an after-dinner speech. I don't think, no one's complaining about those hours. No one is suggesting that I'm in the pocket of LBC or anybody else. But I do think there's an issue. And look, and if Parliament determines that no second jobs at all, we can't have people who are doctors, we can't have people who are lawyers, one job only being an MP, then I will have to live with that like everybody else.
Yeah, I know. It's just, I mean, I know you do LBC, but some of your things, such as speaking at JP Morgan, you gave a speech at Facebook for £3,000. Some people might look at that and think, what's he doing? He's meant to be an MP. Why is he doing that? Does it make you think, oh, maybe actually this doesn't pass the sniff test?
Look, the truth is when you're in opposition and you wanted to do a job as, like being Shadow Foreign Secretary, and your party's just lost an election, there is no money in the coffers, you do try and raise money to help employ people so that you can properly do your job.
So you don't pocket it for yourself personally, it goes into your office?
Some of that money goes towards paying for the things so I can do my job as best as I can. Those are the sorts of decisions that you make. Okay. As I've said, MPs have done speeches and things, corporate speeches, after-dinner speeches for years and years and years and years. There are lots of Conservative colleagues doing it. There are other Labour MPs that have done it. If people determine that they don't want to see that, then that will come to an end and it won't happen.
OK, just finally, are you happy to see Jeremy Corbyn, fellow North London Labour MP for many years, be banned from standing again as a Labour MP?
This is a determination that the NEC have made. They've made the determination for all the reasons that your viewers will know, and it's Jeremy's refusal really to apologise.
But he's your friend, isn't he?
It's not about friendship. These are bigger issues. In representing Tottenham, I represent partly the Stamford Hill area of London, which has a very strong, long-standing Jewish community. So the issue goes to that one, and no one ever said that politics sometimes hasn't got to be brutal. It was an important decision, I think, for both Keir Starmer to take when he took over the Labour Party, to be absolutely clear that we would get rid of that anti-Semitism, and for the NEC to take.
So you think it was the right decision?
I think it was.
OK. All right. David Lammy, thank you so much for your time. It's an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. David Lammy there on a wide range of subjects. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. And if you scan the QR code on screen right now, you can listen to the Beth Rigby Interviews podcast. Each week I take a look at the highlights of my interviews, and there are some extra bits and pieces in there too about the political week. That'll be on the Sky News app or wherever you get your podcasts. Well, that's all for today's show. Thank you so much to my guest, David Lammy, and thank you for watching.